are live on YouTube. Hi all, everybody. Welcome to our weekly online discussion on democracy and COVID-19. As many of you know, I see a lot of familiar faces here this week. We have been trying to keep an eye on the side effects that the measures to combat the coronavirus have had on our democracy. And we see that, of course, a lot of the measures are timely and necessary, but some of them have also had side effects on citizens' democratic rights. And so over the past months, we've been interviewing experts, we've been talking to activists, we've been having these discussion rounds to collect experiences so that we can better understand the impacts that this crisis has had on our democracy. And most importantly, of course, what can we learn from this for the future? Based on these discussions, we want to come up with a set of recommendations on how to make our democracies more resilient for future crises. And tonight, in our sixth discussion already in this series, we have a very interesting panel, a very interesting topic. We will look at how the COVID-19 crisis has affected transparency and accountability in politics. We want to look at how decisions to manage the crisis have been made, if these decisions have been made in a transparent way, if there are checks and balances. What about lobbying during the COVID-19 crisis, and the obviously media saturation with the coronavirus. And we are very, very happy that we have two great speakers, really specialists on the topic with us here tonight. We have Helen Darbishire, who is the Executive Director at Access Info Europe, and Daniel Freund, who is a member of the European Parliament from Germany for the Group of the Greens European Free Alliance. Before we get started, I just want to go through the technicalities of this meeting. So this is a discussion. The idea is that we have a short input from our speakers, but afterwards we really do want everybody to contribute, to ask questions, to share maybe experiences from their countries. So we will start now with a short input, and during that input you are automatically muted. Afterwards you can unmute yourself at any time. There's also a chat function that you can use to ask questions, and there is even a technological way to raise your hands that should be somewhere in the participants box. Then now, without further ado, I would like to start with our first panelist, Helen Darbishire. As I mentioned, the Executive Director of Access Info Europe is an organization that does really great work on ensuring citizens' access to information. So Helen, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Democracy International for the invitation, and it's always a great pleasure to discuss these issues. And it's not the first time during this crisis that I've had the opportunity to discuss them on a panel with Daniel. I'm going to kind of run through three things. First of all, what I think are the lessons learned, if you like, to the extent that there are lessons, what our agenda is as a result of those lessons, and then how we actually try to advance with that agenda. Because I think we have already spent quite a bit of time discussing some of the problems that have come up, although I'll run through what some of those are. And the real challenge perhaps before us is how we act as civil society. I don't know who the people are. I recognize some names of people on the call, but not everybody. So, but how we take forward our agenda to, in this case, as we're talking about this afternoon, to advance and defend transparency, integrity, accountability. I'm speaking to you from Madrid on a pretty hot afternoon in Madrid, I must say. Access Info Europe is based in Madrid. We do a lot of work on European Union transparency, but we also work across Europe and indeed globally. And in addition to being the Executive Director of Access Info, I wear a couple of other hats. I'm on the advisory board of the Open Data Charter, working on open data issues. And also I'm a member of one of the civil society representatives of the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership, which I'll mention again in a moment. I would say my first reflection is that what we've learned from this crisis is things that we pretty much already knew. We've learned a lot about viruses, but I'm talking about in the field of transparency. We knew that we've got problems with the functioning of access to information laws and mechanisms. We knew we didn't have enough proactive publication of data. There are certain kinds of information, be it financial information, lobby registers, company registers, that we've been asking for greater transparency around for quite a long time. I think that what happened during the crisis, especially the sort of in Europe during the sort of early lockdown phases, is that we saw, for example, how when the right of access to information isn't recognized as a fundamental right, as it's not in all countries, it was more vulnerable to being suspended in the state of emergency. We saw the difficulties that journalists have in getting access to data from government, including data about decision making. We saw the way that sometimes privacy gets used to deny access to information, including in some countries at some points who were the experts advising government. We saw that public procurement takes place without sufficient transparency. We saw that where information is not collected, compiled, stored in a digital format, where we have insufficient record keeping, the minute the system comes under pressure, it's suddenly much harder to be able to find, process, and provide to the public that information. We saw that the lobbying regulations aren't always strict enough, because we suddenly moved from lobbying happening in meetings where the rules often require that the meeting minutes be published to tele-lobbying, where lobbying is taking place more virtually and escaping from the lobbying controls. I think we also saw as a kind of general issue that where we have more trust in government, which is often something that is a result of greater transparency, then there was perhaps more trust in what citizens were being asked to do. Where there was greater openness about what was happening, it was easier to bring populations on board. So we saw that transparency is something absolutely essential in a democracy in order to get to have people to ensure legitimacy of decision making. And we saw that where that failed, there was a sort of questioning of how decisions were being taken, who was taking them, why, and so forth. I think we also saw amongst the population in general a renewed interest in data and really being well informed with data. At the same time, to sort of the counterbalance to that, and one of the big threats is the huge amounts of misinformation that is circulating. And if you don't have immediate access to accurate data to counter that misinformation, then it's very difficult for people to know what to believe. And that is a huge problem. So having seen some of these patterns and having seen brought into stark relief and crystallized some of the problems we already knew that we had with our transparency systems, which are not yet perfect or complete or strong enough, the question then is, what's our agenda going forward? And I think that we can identify pretty clearly a number of key action points. And I'm actually I'm flipping to another screen now because I'm working on a report which actually sets out this agenda. So I'm slightly reading from the titles of my report. But that first is we have to strengthen the fundamental right of access to information. We have to recognize that this is a right of citizens, that there are very good reasons why it's important that people be informed, and that this is one of the real fundamentals of our democracies. I think we have to have low tolerance of where that is threatened. And I'm sure Daniel will talk about the issues with rule of law. But I would say that one of the concerns about rule of law is a lack of government openness, which means in turn a lack of accountability and an obstacle to participation. At the EU level, we still have significant problems with the processing of access to information requests. And we have an oversight mechanism in the European Ombudsman, whose office, although the Ombudsman's office does great work in terms of trying to defend this right, her decisions are not binding. And we're seeing an increasing pattern of EU institutions ignoring the decisions of the Ombudsman. The same happens at the national level, where we see that where there are strong information commissioners or similar oversight bodies that can actually order the release of information and protect the right when it's put under pressure, as it was during the crisis, then the right of access to information is better defended than in countries which haven't yet recognized this fundamental right, even though the European Court of Human Rights has recognized it as a fundamental right. So first thing on the agenda, absolutely, is to strengthen the fundamental right and make sure the mechanisms of this right, the requests, the oversight mechanisms are really functioning well. Second is that we need to radically improve our record keeping. And this is linked to also ensuring that records are available in a digital format. I won't go into that in a lot more detail now, but if people have questions, we could talk perhaps about the whole issue of digitalization of information, record keeping. This could be anything from records of deaths, which in many countries the challenge was actually collecting at the center data that was not sort of fully digitalized and in a joined up way at the subnational level. It could also be digitalization of decision making about public procurement, for example, in order to enable rapid publication of contracts, particularly when contracts are issued under emergency procedures. We're too dependent on the request side of the right of access to information, and we do need to strengthen the proactive publication side. This could be in the area, for example, of health information. It could be publishing information about public procurement. There's a whole range of information where we still have too little information that's published proactively. And that goes to my point that I was making about when someone's trying to find information rapidly to counter disinformation, if the information is not already out there, then it's not easily available to members of the public. We need to improve transparency of decision making. We need to know who is behind taking decisions. That includes who are the experts having an input into decisions, including when those people are expert scientists, epidemiologists, whoever it may be, or in whichever field we're talking about. They could be experts in construction if it's decision making about public procurement on construction. But we also need to know who who is ultimately responsible for taking the decision at a political level, because ultimately all decisions, whatever expert input you have, ultimately decisions are political. There we also need to know what lobbying is taking place behind the decision making. We still don't have strong enough lobbying controls at the EU level, and there are many countries around Europe which don't have proper lobbying regulation, and that is a huge problem. My phone's ringing. I hope it's far enough away that we won't interrupt us. Sorry about that. Public procurement, we saw a lot of emergency public procurement taking place. And that shows up how we don't have strong enough transparency around public procurement. There are certain things that EU directives recommend is made available, but it's not strong enough. And when public procurement takes place in an emergency procedure, or it's below a certain threshold of spending, then there's far too little transparency. That links to points that maybe Daniel will pick up on, including about other anti-corruption and integrity mechanisms that civil society has been asking for a long time, such as opening up our company registers. It's been very difficult for investigative journalists during the crisis to track the new companies that have popped up, and that in some case were offering equipment, protective equipment that didn't exist, because we don't have access to the company registers in many countries. And it's really something that governments have been promising to do for a long time, and it's high time we got action on those. Just a couple more points on this agenda, trying to prioritize. automated decision making, use of algorithms to take decisions, there's still too little transparency around how data, including our personal data, is input into decision making that's done in an automated way, as well as too little transparency about the way those algorithms work. And I think that that's something that needs to be an agenda priority. And last point, but really important, it's high time that we fix the balance with privacy. When we're looking at the spending of public funds and the decisions to allocate money to certain companies, the way that decisions are taken, and we hit the obstacle of you can't know who was involved in that meeting, or you can't know who the lobbyists were, or you can't know exactly who the recipients of those funds were on grounds of privacy, I think we have a serious problem, and it's one that really needs addressing. So that's an initial agenda. Last point is the question of how we do all of this. And I think that we're having all these webinars, lots of people are coming together, we're talking about what our agenda is, we've got a pretty clear idea what our agenda is. I think that the question is, how well coordinated are we as civil society to push this agenda? And this is where I'll come back to mentioning the Open Government Partnership, of which many European countries are members. And I think that we should use forums like the Open Government Partnership to really strengthen our agenda setting, which OGP is working on through the Open Response, Open Recovery initiative that it's launched. I think we need to coordinate well with MEPs, which is where I'm about to hand over to Daniel. The intergroup, the anti-corruption intergroup that Daniel set up in the Parliament, which has been very good right from the get-go earlier this year, before we knew all of this was going to happen, reaching out to civil society and trying to coordinate on a common agenda that we all push in order to achieve some of these agenda goals that I've set out, and to ensure that we really strengthen our transparency systems. I don't think it's only about resilience for the next pandemic. Frankly, this one I think is going to be with us for a little while yet. But I think it's just what we should be doing to defend our democracies, pandemic or no pandemic. So maybe we can see that this crisis as an opportunity to push forward with the shared agenda and to actually advance on transparency. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Just want to add one small thing to that. Next week, we have another speaker of Open Government Partnership on our panel about citizen participation. So that will be very exciting. Yeah, and then I would like to hand over the microphone, or the digital microphone, to Daniel Freund, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Greens in Germany. And who, as Helen has already mentioned, also has really made the fight against corruption and the battle for transparent and accountable politics his priority at the European Parliament. So Daniel, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. One of the, I think, great things of Corona is that we have digitized so much, and that I can join you tonight from this fantastic Bavarian Gaststube, where I'm sitting and can discuss Corona with you. I think what Corona has does is it has amplified things. It has amplified the good things and the bad. And I wanted to mention four things in particular that I have seen from my role as a member of the European Parliament. So I'm going to start out with parliamentary control, which obviously under these conditions is more difficult. And we see that in parliaments across the world, I'd say across Europe in particular. In the early days of the crisis, everyone was sort of talking of how this is the time of the executive, right? And that parliaments sort of took more of a back seat, and the executive put the measures in place that were needed, at least where governments function well. And I think it was a difficult time for us parliamentarians to claw back that control, and to some degree we still struggle. From the European Parliament, I can say I've been reasonably impressed of how quickly we have been managing to move things online. Committee meetings, plenaries, that we can vote remotely now, and that was done in a matter of days in a way, and works reasonably well now, that we can vote from pretty much anywhere where we are. MEPs no longer, or at least at this point, do not have to travel unless they want to speak in plenary. But everything else, you can do the committee meetings remotely, we can vote, all this can be done. But of course, being a member of parliament and the control function of parliament is way more than just voting and agreeing on things. And there again, in the early days of the crisis, doing things like not having ghost flights, right? That airlines keep routes serviced because otherwise they lose slots. Agreeing on such things was fairly easy and could be done remotely. But I think when it comes to more contentious issues, things where the majorities aren't as broad, we are seeing that this is difficult, and that building consensus or even discussing with colleagues remotely is a real challenge. We've seen now, at least in the European Parliament, that, for example, even in committees now, we have pre-agreed speaking lists where the slots and the times are allocated beforehand. So everyone comes with their little pre-written statement for that 1 minute intervention that you get. So there's much less listening to each other, replying to each other, arguing, and that is a real issue. And I also see that, for example, in an average week, I don't know, I would probably talk to about 30 colleagues on sort of before or after meetings, in the hallways and all this, and you just don't schedule that many meetings, and just scheduling all those talks is a huge logistical issue. So the whole machine, I think, has gotten a lot slower than it was before, and I would assume that is probably something that parliaments around the world have encountered if they applied any kind of social distancing and lockdown measures. The second thing I'd say is that some executives, heads of state, prime ministers, whatever, particularly autocrats, have actually used that immobilization of parliaments to their advantage, right? Public attention was somewhere else, so this is a great moment to pass all kind of measures that you do not want to be seen. A prime example for that being Hungary, right, where a whole host of measures has passed that Fidesz must have had lying around in a drawer somewhere, just waiting for the right moment to pass this, when, well, partly parliament sort of took itself out of the game, right? The Hungarian parliament voted that Orban could decide by decree and pretty much stop any existing law, and they have passed measures on things like not being able to change gender after birth, which, I mean, someone has to explain to me what the relationship to COVID or fighting the virus is on this one. But also, as Helen has said, things on public procurement, right? Green lighting, huge infrastructure projects that had been in the pipeline, and all of a sudden they're green lighted. There's a high-speed rail between Budapest and the Balkans that will now be built by the Chinese, that was greenlit at the height of the crisis, without proper checks, without the proper procedures that you would have under a normal situation. So, and I think again that is something that has happened in many of the countries where already democracy was under pressure or shaky, whereas in those countries where democracy kind of functions, it also worked under Corona, right? And when I compare how measures were adopted in Hungary with the member state I know best, in Germany, where for all the recovery packages and stuff, it wasn't the government alone and the government majority deciding on this, but they made a deliberative effort to bring the broadest possible majority on board. So also bringing in the liberals, the Greens, the left that isn't currently in government, to have a broad majority to make sure that, you know, it is not just the government pushing through emergency things now. So yeah, as I said, holding governments account under these circumstances certainly isn't easier. Again, I see that in terms of bringing people in for hearings, for questions, also the written questions. Again, I know the situation with the European Commission best, but I myself am waiting for a number of written questions that are way past their deadline now. And of course, you get a bit into that difficult situation of assessing, is this still down to lots of the civil servants, lots of the staff not being able to properly work, right? Those that don't have childcare taken care of, or whatever, the whole machinery being slower than it is under normal circumstances. Is that the reason, or are they using the situation to hold back information that they should be handing out, but they're using Corona as an excuse? Is a difficult call, obviously, to make. The last thing I want to mention is the huge recovery packages or public measures that have been taken, both at the national level, but also collectively now at European level. And obviously, this is incredibly necessary, right? We're seeing the biggest economic slowdown that probably we've ever seen. We're just about to discover the first figures, right, on this, but as far as I can see, this is pretty bad, and across the developed world, it's pretty bad, but in Europe in particular. And so we need these measures, and we need them fast. We need to send these signals. But whenever you spend a lot of money, and this is an unprecedented amount, right? 1.8 trillion euros at the EU level, and about the same again at the national level, collectively in member states. It's sums that we have never ever dealt with before, and they're spent in very short amounts of time. So the corruption risk, or the risk that this is misspent, that there will be maladministration, that there will be fraud, that there will be just ridiculous projects funded with this money, is reasonably high. So, well, as Helen said, me particularly looking at things from a corruption point of view, it's a particular concern to make sure that, yes, this money needs to go out the door quickly, but if it just lands in the pockets of thieves or corrupt autocrats, then this isn't helping anyone. Then we're just getting money out the door, but it's being stolen and not actually reaching the people that it should reach. And well, I guess many of you have followed the discussion around the rule of law mechanism and any kind of link between functioning control mechanisms at the national level, free press, functioning judiciary. Well, basically all those these mechanisms that you need to prevent corruption. Does this actually work in member states, and do we make that a precondition for money flowing into those member states? And it is a bit unclear, I'd say, if you read it positively, whether we have actually made progress or even just held the ground on this one. At least we haven't agreed on a strong mechanism as of yet. We will continue to fight for it and hopefully get somewhere, but it doesn't look too promising. And so there is a risk that a substantial share of this money will actually end up in the wrong hands. And I guess it's all our task for the next month and years to make sure that we do the very best we can to make sure that actually doesn't happen, or happens as little as possible. Maybe that from my side for now, and very much looking forward to the debate.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, I would like to invite anybody who would like to ask a question at this point to jump in. Please raise your hands, that way I can see the order, or you can write it in the chat. Also on YouTube, there's a chat function, and somebody's watching along there to take your questions there as well. So would anyone like to start? Oh, wow. Well, I have a question in that case. Great. Yeah, please go ahead, Daniela. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No, also just to get started, I was a couple minutes late, so I hope I didn't miss it. But yeah, it's great to also see you again, Daniel and Helen, and that we have you both also in one of our webinars. I'd like to go back to the issue of lobbying, and I'd really want to know your opinion of, do you think that there's been a greater threat to, let's say, transparent lobbying since the corona crisis has started? Basically, do you think that there's a greater tendency to lobby, let's say, non-transparently or questionably in the last few months, since we've moved much more digitally and there's been a shift in the media on, I think, much more the health crisis maybe than the kind of policies that have been changing either from the business or economic standpoint, but these kind of issues that maybe citizens might not be really following on their own unless that they are making headlines, trade deals and so on. If they don't make those in the headlines in the media, are these kind of topics, are they kind of sliding through kind of sneaky ways more, or do we not really see that tendency?
Helen, you want to go first, or shall I?
Go ahead, Daniel.
There again on lobbying, I'd say that the first and probably strongest force is that, given that contact with politicians, with the administration has become so much more difficult, I think Corona has basically given more power, more voice to the most established and biggest players, because wherever there is an existing relationship, this was probably able to move online, to move to phone, to move to whatever other channel. But sort of new or smaller players are probably really cut out because they don't have the mobile phone number of cabinet members, of commissioners, or of national ministers, or whatever, to call in. And I think if you look at the emergency measures that were taken in different member states, the big industries that had the most influence even before Corona, they were the ones that managed to get their voices heard, right? Either to get money flowing, to get certain restrictions that were bothering them particularly lifted, whereas single mothers that all of a sudden were left without childcare, they didn't have that voice. They didn't have the organized lobby machinery to ensure that childcare is maybe taken care of before whatever weird industry is brought back online that really isn't so crucial to all of our survival. And I think you see these huge imbalances where certain industries with big lobbying in Germany, first thing I would think about is the car industry. They were heard and they were sort of catered to, whereas those that are traditionally not as organized, that don't have such strong lobbying voices, they're the ones cut out. Otherwise, obviously lobby meetings move online, they move to the phone. I tried to count it for myself. I don't know how much that is representative of really anyone else, but I counted how many lobby meetings I had in the month of April and compared that to January, when there were no measures whatsoever. And the number of lobby meetings I took then remotely or on the phone declined by about 35%. So as I said, I think there has been a bit of a slowdown in the machinery, but obviously this hasn't gone down to zero. And it might be, and we have been actually struggling a bit with the Commission to apply the same transparency standards to video conferences or whatever than they usually do to in-person meetings. And they haven't really given it the same status. So it might actually be that a sizable chunk of lobbying has sort of disappeared in obscurity during the Corona.
Following on from what Daniel was saying, I think that I don't know if we have the data yet, but as I mentioned already, I don't think our lobby transparency mechanisms in many EU member states are strong enough. They're not strong enough at the EU level, for example, with this lack of clarity of what counts as a lobby meeting. there may have been a shift to, maybe Daniel, you were being lobbied less because you weren't the one with the money, or I don't know, but I think that's worth looking at. I'm sure that some people had an increase in lobbying. If you were transport, airlines were lobbying, car companies were lobbying. I think that this is where we also need to recognize that any kind of control system that we need to put in place to ensure that decisions are taken in a way that's for the benefit of the wider public and not because it's been captured by some kind of lobbying, includes the lobbying regulation, but it also includes a series of other things. It does include the record keeping of the meetings so that they can be asked for afterwards via requests for information. It includes, as I mentioned, having really clear that privacy should not be a reason for not giving out the names of lobbyists. It includes having proper justifications of how and why decisions are being taken when it comes to the spending of money, because that's where we're going to see whether the lobbying, I mean, lobbying can happen, but is it effective or not? Are decisions being taken which seem to have been guided by lobbying or because of other criteria such as having environmental considerations in mind? For example, where's the actual studies on that? Where's the impact assessments? Where are the justifications of why decisions were taken? Who were the people who actually got the contracts? If we don't have clarity on the if we can't access company registers to be able to see who are the people linked to the companies that are getting the contracts, we're not going to be able to join up the dots and know whether it's a result of contacts and lobbying that the procurement contracts went to certain firms. There have been some scandals already, but that's when the investigative journalists do their digging. We don't have the mechanisms sufficiently well instituted. So I would say lobbying should be a real priority, transparency of lobbying. And that's where I think having the EU taking a bit more of a lead and having a push to have lobbying regulation across all member states would be very useful.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I just want to mention for the participants who wrote those questions, you are also very welcome to ask them live. Otherwise, I can read them. So I'd just like to ask Emirhan, if you would like to ask your question yourself. That's usually a little bit better than when I read it because I'm not always sure I say it right. So if you would like to ask your question yourself, feel free to unmute yourself. No. Okay. In that case, I will go ahead and read it. So Emirhan wrote, in the fall, elections will be held in the United States and President Trump is thinking aloud about postponing them and is mentioning problems with postal voting. President Trump has played on Twitter with the thought of postponing the November election because of the corona crisis. Criticism has followed promptly, even among Republicans. Critics accuse Trump of discrediting the election now because he faces defeat. And the question then is, could any democracy and any regular democratic election be damaged by corona? And if yes, what is the expectation that a problem like this can spread to other countries?
Well, I absolutely think that there is a huge risk, right? Because there are some health situations where you clearly cannot vote under the same circumstances as before, and basically then assessing is that situation reached or not is not straightforward. And we have basically seen, I mean, maybe Donald Trump is sort of on one end of the scale. He is facing defeat, so he wants to drag out being voted out of office for as long as possible. In Poland, we have probably seen it the other way around. They wanted to hold the election as quickly as possible while they were still ahead. And we've seen that not to the same degree, but a bit like that in at least parts of Germany, where I'm from in Germany, where we're now holding local elections on the 13th of September. So all the lists and candidates had to be submitted at still, well, in June, when we were still in lockdown and having party assemblies that vote on lists and stuff was difficult. And there as well, the Conservatives that shot up in the polls during the height of the Corona lockdown had a very strong interest that the election not be postponed. So I think what should happen in those situations is that the government doesn't decide alone, right? That it is the broadest possible cross-party consensus reached on what should happen, and that you try to agree with everyone basically when is the right moment to vote, or when is the right situation to postpone an election. Obviously, the situation in the US where they discredit mail-in votes and stuff, I mean, that is bullshit. Everyone knows it. He's being flagged, or even has his posts deleted now by Twitter, Facebook, and other social media sites. I mean, everything that countries can do, of course, to allow for safer forms of voting, that's great. But I also understand that some of these machines are big and slow, and that it's not always possible in a matter of weeks, sometimes not even in a matter of months, to, for example, shift an election entirely to a mail-in ballot or something. But as much as countries can do that and should in a way, regardless of this pandemic, allow as many different forms of voting as possible, so that people have it easier to participate. I think that regardless of this pandemic and the specific issues of this is always good for democracy, to make it as easy as possible for people to participate in an election.
I think that this question also, I mean, I agree with what Daniel says. A lot of analysts were saying that Trump he was also timed his comments rather well to distract a bit from some really bad economic news, as well as rising COVID infection rates. So to what extent it's a sort of serious proposal, but it doesn't look like it can happen. I mean, in France, there are definitely going to be situations in which, and it happened in France with the 2 rounds of the municipal elections, where it was clear that the second round it wasn't going to be possible to hold it. So there may be some circumstances in which delays to elections or changes to the way that the elections take place is justified and legitimate. I think the question is, has everything been done to ensure that you replicate as near as possible the situation, the sort of the normal and hopefully closer to ideal situation? And this comes back to the point I was making about digitalization more generally. We've seen some really interesting things happen with digitalization, where there has been a rapid move from, actually, I had the former Prime Minister of Finland saying that although the schools in Finland thought they were pretty well digitalized, they realized at the beginning of the pandemic that they had some work to do, and they had to implement things they'd been waiting to do for quite a few years very rapidly, and they managed to do it. Similarly, in Greece, we saw digitalization of prescriptions, which is something apparently that had been pending, and then was implemented very rapidly when it became a pressing need. So allowing people to participate in elections perhaps more easily through digital, postal, whatever, could be great. There are some countries that are quite well advanced with digital referenda, digital voting. But it has to be done with proper scrutiny and ensuring that it actually works. And there, I think, we get the question, and maybe you'll talk about it in your next week's panel about participation, of the highlighting of the digital divide. And how we've seen in many countries, even in well-developed Europe, where many school children, for example, didn't have the equipment needed to fully participate in online education, where not everyone will find it easy to do their interactions with local authorities via their computers. And so I do think that we have to really be careful about not creating a sort of 2-track society where some people have access to the digital services, to the information, as information is available digitally but not in other formats, and take that into consideration when we are designing any new systems. And I think that going forward, we've all, I mean, for all of us here who are on these webinars, I haven't had to travel to lots of places to participate. I've seen Daniel far more than I would have done in a normal 4 or 5 months, and many other MEPs as well. So for me, from a participation perspective, as an NGO that works at the Brussels level but is sitting in Madrid, I think I've actually lobbied or participated more than I would have done normally. It's great, it's fantastic, and I haven't had to travel, and I can't go out and meet my friends for a drink in the evening, but I can relax and do something else. There are lots of positive things that we're finding from the reliance on digital, but as we've already talked about in the context of lobbying, and it would be a consideration in the context of participation, we need to ensure that, and it could be the same with voting, that any sort of digital version of what we used to do offline is genuinely inclusive and representative and doesn't exclude certain communities.
Great, thank you. There's a number of questions in the chat, but before that, I believe Daniela, who is from Michigan, from the US, wanted to add something about mail-in voting. So please go ahead, Daniela.
Yeah, just a quick point about this. I mean, I'm American, so I feel like I also have many emotions about this as well. But I think something that's not getting a lot of attention right now is that Trump wants to call the election on the very night of election night. I mean, there's, you know, we know about his tweets against mail-in voting, calling absentee voting that it's fraud. But this isn't getting a lot of attention, that he's saying we will call the election on election night. Because if it's true that the US will have the most absentee ballots, the most mail-in ballots than ever before in history, probably, where the US Postal Service will probably be very overwhelmed, already announcing now that they need extra help, extra pairs of hands to get those mail-in ballots in order. That means that those absentee ballot results will be coming in not just on election night, but really in the days and perhaps weeks after the election. And there's actually this phenomenon that's called the blue shift. And that's where we can really expect that a majority of the mail-in votes are Democratic votes. This is just from former elections that have shown us that mostly Democratic voters are the ones who make use of absentee voting and mail-in voting, and which of course makes sense why Republicans for years have made absentee voting difficult, where in many Republican states you need, for example, a real reason to even request an absentee ballot. Yeah, so the fact that Trump is saying that the election needs to be called on election night in a year where there will be such an overwhelming number of mail-in votes is also something I find really alarming, that I don't think is getting enough attention. Yeah, and then this year the US election should really not just be considered one election night, but rather it should be like an election season in order to really protect the integrity of the elections, make sure that every vote is counted. But I just want to make a point about that, because I don't think it's being talked about just enough.
Great, thank you. Yes, and then the next question is Mohammed. I believe you'd like to ask it live, right? Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for your presentations. My question is, how can we make sure that the governments give us the real numbers of casualties of humans affected by this virus and economic results of this virus? If we make sure through international organizations how we can get our government to be true towards issuing information to the population.
Yeah,
You want to
Daniel,
do this, Helen?
Well, I can kick it off at least. I mean, this is a problem that happened. For example, I'm just thinking of the case because I heard about it on a webinar the other day. The case in Brazil, where there were real problems getting access to the COVID-19 infection and death rates, and a number of newspapers, as I understand, really collaborated, gathering data at the local level and trying to compile an alternative set of statistics. I would say that how do we ever know the government's giving us true information? That is a question. Sometimes governments have information that is incorrect, in fact, and once it is published, is corrected. We need to have multiple sources of information and to know that multiple people are contributing to it, and have professional organizations and a free press which is able to check, double check, verify, cross-reference, and so forth. Our information systems are actually very complex in any society. It's where we have limitations on those information systems, such as, and this is a rule of law issue within the European Union, with the case of Hungary, for example, and the pressure on the newspaper index recently, where you're limiting the free press, which is going to do the checking and cross-checking and letting us know whether the data seems to be correct or not. It's then that we have problems. So I think it's not only a question of should I blindly or not trust what the government's telling me, it's you really need to look at what are all the checks and balances in the information system, and are they also functioning? Are investigative journalists able to do their work? And that really is a big challenge in many countries. And what we see where that doesn't work is that's where you also get a decline in trust. But sometimes, and I do think that when we see something like what's happened recently in Hungary with Index, I really do think that that's where we need to have a proper response at the EU level, because information is really the lifeblood of our democracies. Daniel, you mentioned that you're not really sure how well the rule of law conditionality, if we can call it that, it's not quite conditionality, is going to work. And I think that goes back to the agenda I was trying to outline. We as a civil society around Europe, small and underfunded as we tend to be, we really need to be coordinating to raise the alarm wherever we see problems with the rule of law, with freedom of expression, with access to information, and all these other complementary democratic mechanisms within the European space, at least. I don't know where you're from, Mohammed, and which country you're thinking of in particular, but that would be my sort of initial response. Where are you from, actually?
I'm from Morocco.
You're from Morocco, yeah. And there are questions of press freedom there, for example, right? And civil society, how strong and how independent is civil society? Yeah.
I mean, one thing that is great is that the world is more interconnected than ever. We have more online access than ever across the world, and so people that really want to find out, even in countries where there isn't that much free media left or something. In many of those places, you can actually still get access to media from outside the country that can provide a more accurate picture. Not everyone can, not everyone does speak the languages, and so on. But nevertheless, it has become more difficult, I think, for governments to hide these kind of things than before. And I think particularly on the question whether governments are publishing adequate numbers on corona numbers, is given that the wealth of statistics from countries around the world that is available, you can basically do a lot of tests whether your numbers fit the mold, right? And there is other numbers that you can use to get an idea on. I mean, even if the government releases wrong figures on the coronavirus, either infections or I guess what more governments are even doing on the death, then, well, one thing is you can do the excess death rate, but you can also sometimes see what the situation in different hospitals is, how many people are registering as sick. I mean, obviously, there's also countries where all data is fiddled with or isn't available or isn't accurate, and then it becomes very difficult. But in a way, this is, as Helen has said, it is a standard problem of government accountability, and those governments that have very low accountability already before this crisis, then it is difficult also during this situation. But Helen wanted to intervene, I think, again.
So just to come in with another point that's kind of linked to this, nothing to do with coronavirus, but during these last few months, Access Info has been doing a lot of work on data around the SDGs. It was a project that we'd started last year, and we'd been looking specifically at European countries publishing or not data about SDG 5, which is gender equality. And we did a survey across 7 countries in Europe and found that on average, only 57% of the data related to gender equality indicators was available. Some countries were much better. UK, Germany, Austria wasn't bad. France had only, like, I can't remember the exact number, I think it was 36% of the data linked to gender equality indicators was public. We're now broadening this out to look at a fuller range of SDG indicators. Eurostat, interestingly, is only collecting data against 100 indicators, which are more or less similar to the 232 SDG indicators. For reasons that I still haven't fully comprehended, how they've decided that some of them are not fully relevant for Europe, even though one of the ones we identified was female genital mutilation, which is actually something that is an issue in some communities across Europe. So I think that one of the, and Daniel, you were talking about the comparability of data between countries, but what we're seeing is that if you don't have any data at all published, you can't even begin to compare it. And so I do think that as we move forward, hopefully beyond this crisis, and we focus back on, because the economic crisis that's just coming, as Daniel, you were saying, is really going to hit very hard on development. We need to be looking at how we're tracking against the Sustainable Development Goals and how we're actually advancing, because I think there'll be a real setback. And indeed, someone said that on environmental indicators, Europe's actually already been falling behind the progress that it should be making to reach its goals by 2030. We need data to be able to track that. We still have too little data. And I think that whilst we're all focused on the coronavirus and the health data and the financial data, which is absolutely super important to have transparent, we shouldn't forget the other complementary data sets which help us understand the knock-on effects of the crisis on education, on gender equality, for example, and participation of women in the workforce, and so on and so forth. So there really is there's a lot of data that we need to continue demanding be collected in the first place and made public.
Great, thank you very much. The next question in the chat is from Anne. Anne, do you want to go ahead and yeah.
Hi, thanks. I'll try to make this a little less US-centric. Suppose you lived in a country where economic relief money, COVID relief money, is going to businesses that are friends of the administration rather than perhaps more deserving businesses. And you've got a Congress that is divided. What's the citizen to do? That's my question. What can we do as citizens to combat this?
I'm actually working on a really interesting project right now across a number of European countries, Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Spain, financed by the European Commission, looking at public procurement. And we're looking at what data is available at the local level on public procurement, and what data is available at when the public procurement is for lower sums of money. And we're looking at how to work with, first of all, developing a computer tool which can help track this and identify where there might be problems, but also training local journalists, and eventually the idea is to train local civil society groups to be able to understand how to track how money is being spent. And I think that that's really important. I think that there are initiatives in many countries, and civil society is doing a lot to track spending. So ordinary citizens, active citizens, perhaps can try to find out what those initiatives are and engage. There are things that also could be replicated. There was something that was done in Italy called Open Coesione about EU cohesion funds, which resulted in people that are closer to where the money is being spent on the ground being able to identify where there are problems. And this is, again, where we absolutely, it comes back to my comment about privacy, even for smaller amounts of money, we need to know who the recipients of the funds are, be they businesses or SMEs or sort of individuals who are operating as businesses, which is often a problem. We need to know who the recipients of the funds are in order to be able to identify where there might be problems. And it is often, particularly when money is spent at the local level, as it will be in this recovery package, it's local citizens, local civil society organizations, local journalists will be better at identifying where there's problems. So I think that perhaps more collaboration and information sharing amongst civil society would be good. The big challenge that we have in Europe is that there really is, compared with some other parts of the world, like the non-EU European countries or Latin America, we've got actually far less funding for civil society to do this kind of monitoring. And I very much hope that the European Union going forward, the European Commission, with some of its lines of support for civil society, of which there are too few, will continue to support this kind of oversight from society. Because without that, there's definitely going to be more abuse in the spending of these funds.
I mean, the first thing is you need a strong case, right? So you need to know that that is actually what's happening. That already in some countries is a huge issue. You might have an idea that it's happening, but you can't prove it. You don't have the concrete data. So that's the first hurdle you need to clear. And I think Helen has given some good tips on how that could be done. Once you do have the information, then it needs to go basically through the normal justice system, as long as that's still working, right? I'd say that in the US, probably like prosecutors and the courts still do work to a large degree. So that's where you need to go, right? You need to get the prosecutors on those cases, and if they find out that people from around Trump or from the Republican Party are being advantaged in these programs, then that needs to be investigated and needs to be corrected. And what usually helps for that is public pressure, including, of course, most importantly, at the ballot box. That I think is something that we all, of course, can help with to some degree. But I would like to emphasize again that importance of actually knowing of who receives these funds, because even in countries that are reasonably transparent and do maybe even publish the companies or the structures, the organizations that do receive public funding, puzzling that together of who are the beneficial owners, who are the people really behind those structures, can be incredibly difficult. And being a member of the Budgetary Control Committee in the European Parliament, I struggle with this all the time. We have a case in the Czech Republic where one of the largest beneficiaries of EU funds is the Prime Minister of the country, Andrej Babiš. And he owns a huge conglomerate of agricultural companies, food processing companies, and so on. So even knowing which companies actually do belong to him is incredibly difficult. And we have that fun situation where there should now be beneficial ownership registries in all EU countries. And if you look into those registers in different EU countries, in some of them, Andrej Babiš is the beneficial owner of some of these companies, and then in the neighboring country he isn't, and in the third country no owner at all appears in the list of a company that supposedly belongs to the conglomerate that he owns. So even where these kind of mechanisms and where the transparency does exist, implementation and it actually working on the ground can be a different thing. But I think with sort of billionaires in politics, and particularly in the highest office of a country, naturally you get into very bizarre situations where they can funnel money into their own pockets. Andre Babiš is an example. Donald Trump, I think, is another good example for that, and it gets very, very weird. So what I would recommend is anyone don't elect billionaires into politics. I just don't think it's a good idea.
I think that's great advice. There is a comment in the chat from Ronnie. I don't know if you have a question that goes with that. Do you want to go and explain a little bit?
Actually, I think you skipped me, Caroline.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't think that was a question. Please go ahead, Cesare.
Let me turn on my camera real quick. Is my video on? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm helping to coordinate an international network of citizen assembly meetings online. In our citizen assemblies, we use the most powerful philosophical and political networking platform in the world called Agora, the worldwide stock market of ideas. Agora enables everyone to develop their own political philosophy out of various ideas. It demonstrates which ideas are most strongly supported by the people, and then it creates political candidates who truly represent the will of the people. Are you interested in joining us? The meeting times are in the comments in the chat. But we can, of course, arrange more meetings. That's the whole point. It's about decentralizing democracy, making it convenient and accessible to anyone, everywhere, when it works for them, to discuss the issues that are relevant to them, the ones that they want to share information about, the ones they want to learn about. So are you interested in joining us?
Great. So for anyone who's interested in joining that, the information is in the chat. I don't know if Helen or Daniel, if you want to comment on this, or. Okay. Then Ronnie, I don't know if you would like to mention, if you would like to explain your comment a little bit, because I'm not sure I can do it justice. Actually, someone in the chat is asking also to repost the information. Cesare, please answer that. And then I would have one last question before we round off this panel. In times of crisis like this, we see that that quick decisions are necessary, and Daniel, you've mentioned that even parliaments have had trouble to find new ways of decision making. So my question is, how is there a way that we can make this quick decision making compatible with participation and with transparency? Are there any good examples that either of you have seen in countries around the world that have managed to do that?
Well, I mean, in times of crisis, obviously you need to take quick decisions, but oftentimes quick decisions is not a good way of taking decisions, right? So democracy, I think, is best when it takes its time. Slow politics in a way is best when you have the proper time to consult, to prepare, to really reflect and come to good decisions. When you have the gun to your head in a way, and you need to be fast because a virus is spreading or something, obviously you need to act. But those are also situations that if the political system is working properly, that should have been prepared And I think we've seen a bit now during this crisis, those countries, those political systems that have dealt slightly better with this than others, because I think to a degree they had prepared, they had plans in the drawer somewhere that they could take out, and they knew somewhat what to do with this, and then the rest you complement by a sound appreciation of science and listening to experts, rather than saying that you know it all and anyone else is fake news or an idiot. So I think that's something that we all have to work on, and then make sure that when the crisis is not there, that then you take your time to do good decisions, to not push things to all eternity, but that you set up things so that the next crisis that will surely come can be better handled. And I think for the European Union, one good example for that is it's never a good moment to talk fundamental reform of the EU, but we have seen that having been hit by crisis after crisis over the last 10, 15 years, that there are some fundamental flaws in the system that need to be addressed. And I think that is something that politics also needs to do, is not to say we're always running after the latest crisis, but to take a step back and make sure that the more fundamental issues are addressed. And I think if that is managed, then it's sort of politics at its best. Then you do take the time for citizen consultation, for broad inclusion of society. And I think one good example for this is this climate convention that the French have been doing. And I was very impressed that even under this difficult condition of Corona and lockdown, and France has been hit more severely than many other developed countries early on, and that they managed to bring this to close and even continue for people to continue to meet, because particularly I think these citizens assembly type engagements are difficult to do online, and you get very different results when people interact personally. So that was an impressive and a good example, I think, of how things should be done.
Yeah, I very much agree with Daniel on the slow democracy, slow decision making. And Caroline, you put in the chat the blurb for next week's session, which includes Helen Darbishire from the Open Government Partnership. Looks like it's going to be interesting. I think this brings us full circle to some of the points that I was making at the beginning. The biggest lesson we've learned is that we weren't fully prepared and organized, and that our systems for transparency and therefore for participation weren't quite robust enough. So a few decisions had to be taken super fast, but let's not exaggerate. We've seen the problem with emergency procurement, where suddenly all procurement has flipped to being emergency procurement just because we're in crisis mode. That's not actually necessary. We've also learned that there were warnings given and that there was a lack of preparedness, greater transparency about that, and greater sort of participation and greater listening to the experts perhaps would have put us in a state of better preparedness for this particular crisis. Absolutely, we need to start preparing now, and we know it, for the environmental crisis. We need to be doing everything that we can. And I think that through greater transparency and greater participation in decision making, it can perhaps actually help us reach better decisions. I don't think that with the, I gave my prediction earlier, I hope I'm wrong, but I think that the coronavirus crisis is not going to disappear as rapidly as we would like. And I think that we don't need to be in crisis mode. We have to adjust to this new normality. It's not an excuse anymore to bypass the democratic systems. We've had a rapid shift, but we need to we need to ensure that most decisions are being taken with maximum transparency and participation now, even if we're actually in coronavirus crisis mode for the next couple of years, or however long it unfortunately lasts. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts. And one last thing that I didn't actually mention to Anne's last question in terms of what citizens can do is citizens can get informed about your right of access to information. And we're talking, this calls about transparency. What can you, we've gone off to some other topics, bigger democratic topics, but coming back to the right of access to information is a right that all international human rights tribunals have recognized is a right that belongs to each of us. Okay, so we all have a right to request and in the majority of cases receive information from our respective governments or from any government indeed. So learn about your right of access to information, learn how to ask for information, find out who the local NGO is, because every country in Europe has an access to information law, and every country has an or more than one NGO working on having to implement that law. There are lots of online platforms at the EU level. There's something called Ask the EU, which my organization Access Info runs. So actually use your right to get informed, to be able to participate. And Daniel, you mentioned the ballot box. I guess we're talking about the digital ballot box or whatever it is now in the future. But it's not only at the moment of the ballot box, it's between elections that we can also engage and raise our voices. And I think that that's something that, that's what we as civil society organizations are there to help guide citizens on how to do it. And actually there are a lot of people working inside governments, trying to make governments more transparent as well. That's something that's supported very much through the Open Government Partnership. So learn about your rights and exercise them. I think that's one thing that we can all do to be more empowered and to help defend and strengthen democracy.
Thank you so much. It's great to finish off this panel with some practical advice and something that we can all do. I think it's a really nice thing to end this panel on. It's not all doom and gloom. There are things that we can do and actions that we can take. So I think we have come to the end of this discussion. I just really would like to thank both of our panelists for their really interesting inputs and their great work, and all of you for tuning in and for asking questions and for sharing experiences from your country. It's been mentioned a couple of times, but we do have a standing appointment on Tuesday, so we have another session next Tuesday where we will continue. It's the last session actually already, where we will discuss citizen participation under a lockdown with Helen Darbishire, who's actually here in this call. I noticed. Sorry, she's of Open Government Partnership. We will also have Thorsten Sterk of the German Citizen Council and Karl-Heinz Lamberts, who's the president of the Parliament for the German-speaking community in Belgium, who have introduced the world's first permanent citizen council. And I'm sure that also the French Citizen Council on Climate will come up during that session that Daniel has mentioned. So for sure it will be a very interesting session. So do all tune in for that. Daniel and maybe some other people has posted links in the chat. I will make sure that those are also on the website for anybody who hasn't downloaded it. Yes, thank you very much, and have a nice evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure.